For generations, the Earth has guarded traces of Native American life that challenged accepted ideas about the past. Buried settlements, ritual remains, enigmatic artifacts, and evidence of sudden violence have forced researchers to confront chapters filled with unanswered tension. Some discoveries were so unsettling that their meaning remained debated for decades. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in. In the high, dry landscape of southwestern Colorado, the remnants of a small ancestral Pueblo settlement rest among sandstone, juniper, and open stretches of earth. Today, the area known as Cowboy Wash appears quiet, almost ordinary. Yet, beneath that silence, archaeologists uncovered evidence of an episode so disturbing that it became one of the most debated archaeological cases in the American Southwest. The discoveries emerged during excavations of several structures dating to roughly AD 1150, a period marked by environmental pressure, social disruption, and the eventual abandonment of many settlements across the Four Corners region. Inside the Cowboy Wash structures, researchers recovered human remains mixed with broken pottery, stone tools, and other household debris. But it was the condition of some of those remains that drew extraordinary attention. Bones displayed patterns that researchers interpreted as possible signs of human processing. Some had been broken, burned, or fragmented, while microscopic analysis of certain specimens reportedly revealed traces of human tissue residue inside a cooking vessel. These observations contributed to the controversial interpretation that cannibalism may have occurred at the site. Yet, archaeology rarely offers such a simple answer. Human bones can be damaged by many processes: fire, weathering, animals, excavation, and the ordinary destruction associated with abandoned settlements can all alter skeletal remains. Distinguishing deliberate processing from accidental damage requires careful examination of patterns across an entire assemblage. At Cowboy Wash, investigators argued that the evidence represented something more deliberate than ordinary funerary treatment. If people had processed human remains for consumption, what circumstances could have driven such an act? One explanation connects the evidence to severe social and environmental instability during the late 12th century. Drought affected the region. Agricultural production became increasingly difficult, and communities faced pressures that may have intensified competition over food and resources. In such an environment, an isolated episode of extreme violence might have emerged from desperation, conflict, or some form of social collapse. But another possibility has received attention as well: warfare and intimidation. Some researchers have suggested that the remains could reflect violence associated with raids or intergroup conflict rather than survival cannibalism. In that interpretation, the destruction of bodies may have been connected to acts of terror, ritual violence, or the deliberate humiliation of enemies. Human remains were not necessarily treated as food simply because they were heavily processed. And then there is the larger question of evidence itself. Cowboy Wash represents only a small archaeological window into a much broader world. Ancient Pueblo communities practiced complex funerary traditions, maintained intricate social networks, and adapted to changing ecological conditions. To interpret one disturbing assemblage as representative of an entire culture would be deeply misleading. The archaeological record is fragmentary, and the people who left these remains behind cannot speak for themselves. This is where the case becomes especially difficult. The evidence has been presented as one of the strongest archaeological arguments for prehistoric cannibalism in the American Southwest, yet interpretations remain contested. Questions have been raised about the context of the remains, the meaning of the microscopic evidence, and whether the available data can distinguish cannibalism from other forms of violent body processing. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Cowboy Wash is not simply the possibility that people consumed human flesh. It is the possibility that an extraordinary event occurred during a period of profound instability, and that the surviving evidence is too incomplete to tell us precisely why. Were these remains the aftermath of starvation, warfare, ritual violence, or something else entirely? The fragments remain where they were left, preserving traces of an episode separated from us by centuries. And somewhere within those fragments may be evidence capable of changing how this ancient community is understood, if only we knew how to read it. Not far from the broad curves of the Missouri River in present-day South Dakota, the ground rises into a quiet landscape of grass, wind, and open sky. There is little on the surface to suggest what once happened here. Yet, beneath that earth lay the remains of a fortified settlement whose inhabitants experienced one of the most disturbing episodes ever documented in the archaeology of the North American plains. The site is known as Crow Creek. Dating to roughly the late 13th century, the settlement was occupied by people associated with the initial Middle Missouri tradition. Its position along the Missouri River placed it within a landscape of fertile soil, hunting grounds, waterways, and established trade routes. But the community also existed during a period when competition over resources appears to have intensified. When archaeologists began examining the site, they encountered something far beyond the ordinary remains of a prehistoric village. Hundreds of human skeletons had been discovered within and around the settlement. Many displayed injuries consistent with violent death. Some skulls showed fractures, while other bones carried cut marks or signs of damage inflicted around the time of death. The remains included men, women, and children. The pattern suggested that this was not simply a cemetery. It appeared to be the aftermath of a massacre. But what happened at Crow Creek, and why? Archaeological evidence indicates that the settlement had defensive features, including a substantial earthwork enclosure. Such fortifications suggest that violence was not an abstract possibility. The inhabitants may have lived with the expectation that rival groups could attack. At some point around AD 1325, that threat appears to have become reality. Researchers have proposed that an attacking group entered the settlement and killed a large portion of its inhabitants. Some victims seem to have suffered blows to the head, while others were apparently mutilated after death. The bodies were eventually left in or around the settlement rather than receiving the careful treatment associated with ordinary burial. The sheer number of victims makes the discovery difficult to comprehend. Yet, archaeology can reveal the physical consequences of violence more easily than its causes. There is no surviving eyewitness account explaining who attacked Crow Creek, what triggered the conflict, or what happened immediately afterward. One leading interpretation centers on environmental stress. The centuries surrounding the massacre were marked by climatic fluctuations across parts of the plains. Population pressures, changing agricultural conditions, competition for productive land, and shortages of resources may have contributed to increasingly hostile relationships between neighboring communities. If several groups depended upon the same limited resources, a fortified village could become both a refuge and a target. But there may have been deeper motives. The massacre could have resulted from retaliation following earlier violence. It may have been connected to territorial disputes or competition between neighboring communities. Some researchers have also considered whether warfare served social or political purposes beyond acquiring food or land. And then there is a more unsettling possibility. Could the violence have been intended not merely to defeat an opposing community, but to erase it? The archaeological record cannot answer that directly. What it does show is a level of brutality extending beyond the simple act of killing. Certain remains display evidence of post-mortem treatment that has led researchers to consider whether the attackers wanted to intimidate survivors, desecrate enemies, or express some form of hostility that carried symbolic meaning. Still, caution is essential. Ancient violence is easy to interpret through modern assumptions. A damaged skeleton cannot tell us what the people involved believed. Even when the physical evidence is clear, its social meaning can remain uncertain. Crow Creek, therefore, presents two mysteries at once. The first concerns the massacre itself: who carried it out and what drove them to attack. The second concerns the society that existed before the violence, its alliances, rivalries, fears, and pressures. Perhaps the most haunting detail is that the settlement did not simply preserve evidence of death. It preserved evidence of a community caught at a moment when ordinary life suddenly collapsed. The wind still moves across the Missouri landscape, while beneath the soil, fractured bones and scattered traces preserve a story only partly understood. How many tensions led to that final confrontation, and how much of the story disappeared with those who died? Crow Creek gives us the aftermath. The reasons remain buried with the people who witnessed it. From the wooded floodplains of southwestern Illinois, the landscape around ancient Cahokia rises gently beneath the open Midwestern sky. Today, the great earthen mounds are surrounded by roads, fields, and modern development. But more than 1,000 years ago, this was the center of one of the largest urban societies ever established in prehistoric North America. Among its many monuments, one mound has revealed a burial complex unlike almost anything else in the region. Mound 72 stands near the southern edge of the ancient city. When archaeologists investigated it, they discovered that the mound was not simply a burial monument. Beneath its layers of carefully placed earth lay an extraordinary collection of human remains, arranged in patterns that appeared to reflect a complex sequence of ceremonial events. Cahokia flourished roughly between AD 900 and 1350, reaching its greatest influence around the 11th and 12th centuries. Thousands of people lived across the surrounding settlements, while monumental earthworks transformed the landscape into a carefully organized ceremonial and political center. Mound 72 belonged to this world. Inside and around the mound, archaeologists identified hundreds of individuals. Some had been placed in carefully arranged groups, while others appeared to have been buried under very different circumstances. The most remarkable discovery was a central burial containing the remains of an adult male, surrounded by an elaborate arrangement of other individuals. Nearby, researchers uncovered several mass graves containing young women, many of whom appear to have died around the same time. The pattern raised an extraordinary possibility: ritual sacrifice. But the evidence requires careful interpretation. Some of the individuals were placed in ways suggesting organized ceremonial activity rather than ordinary burial. Their age and sex distributions were unusual, and the arrangement of the remains appeared highly deliberate. Archaeologists have therefore proposed that at least some of these deaths may have been connected to ritual practices involving human sacrifice. What kind of ceremony could have required so many lives? One interpretation connects the burials to Cahokia's political and religious structure. In many complex societies, monumental ceremonies could reinforce the authority of rulers, priests, or elite families. Death itself could become part of a ritual language, communicating power, hierarchy, devotion, or renewal. At Mound 72, the central individual may have occupied a position of exceptional importance. His burial was accompanied by enormous quantities of carefully arranged materials, suggesting that he may have been a powerful political or religious figure. But who were the people buried around him? Were they attendants, captives, relatives, ritual participants, or victims selected for a ceremony whose meaning has been lost? The evidence does not provide a definitive answer. Some researchers have suggested that the young women may have been sacrificed as part of a major ceremonial event. Others have emphasized that the exact circumstances of their deaths remain difficult to reconstruct. Archaeological evidence can establish patterns of burial, but it cannot always reveal intention. There are also broader interpretations. Mound 72 may have been connected to ideas of cosmology, fertility, warfare, ancestry, or the movement between different realms of existence. Cahokia's monuments were not simply enormous piles of earth. Their arrangement appears to have reflected a highly structured worldview in which political authority, religion, landscape, and celestial observation were deeply connected. In that context, death may have carried meanings very different from those understood today. Still, the possibility of deliberate human sacrifice remains one of the most unsettling aspects of the site. Could the burials represent a single extraordinary ceremony? Or were they accumulated through several events separated by years? Was sacrifice an established practice at Cahokia, or did Mound 72 preserve an exceptional moment that should not be generalized to the entire society? Even the identity of the central figure remains uncertain. His burial suggests enormous importance, yet no written record tells us his name, his position, or the events that surrounded his death. The people accompanying him remain equally silent. And so, Mound 72 leaves us with an unsettling archaeological portrait. A monumental society capable of extraordinary organization, artistic achievement, and religious expression, but also capable, perhaps, of ceremonies in which human lives became offerings. The earth preserves the arrangement of the dead with remarkable precision, but the beliefs that gave those arrangements meaning have largely disappeared. What happened at Mound 72, and what did those who stood beside the graves believe they were accomplishing? After the violence preserved at Mound 72, another archaeological site offers a very different glimpse into the darker pressures that could fracture a prehistoric community. In the rolling landscape of southwestern Colorado, near the town of Durango, a low ridge rises above the surrounding terrain. There is little today to distinguish it from the hills around it. Yet, beneath that quiet ground, archaeologists found evidence of a violent episode that appears to have torn a community apart. The site became known as Sacred Ridge. Dating to around AD 800, Sacred Ridge was associated with the early Puebloan communities of the northern Southwest. Excavations revealed architectural remains, household materials, animal bones, pottery fragments, and human remains. At first glance, it appeared to represent an ordinary settlement, but the skeletal evidence told a far more troubling story. Dozens of people had died violently. The remains displayed injuries consistent with severe physical trauma. Some individuals appeared to have been struck repeatedly, while others showed evidence of violent treatment after death. The bodies were not arranged like a conventional cemetery. Instead, the remains were scattered through architectural spaces and refuse deposits, suggesting that the final moments of the settlement involved extraordinary disorder. What could have produced such devastation? Researchers have proposed that Sacred Ridge was the scene of a massacre carried out during a period of intense social conflict. The victims included men, women, and children, suggesting that the violence was not restricted to a particular group of combatants. But the details become more difficult when the evidence is examined closely. Some remains show signs of burning, dismemberment, and other forms of post-mortem manipulation. These discoveries have led archaeologists to consider whether the attackers were motivated by more than simple territorial competition. Was the destruction intended to eliminate an entire community? Was it an act of retaliation, or did the violence have a ritual dimension? The most widely discussed interpretation connects Sacred Ridge to conflict within a changing social landscape. During this period, communities in the northern Southwest were experiencing demographic and cultural transformations. Groups were expanding, settlements were becoming more complex, and relationships between communities may have become increasingly tense. Competition over land, water, food, and political influence could have created conditions in which disputes escalated rapidly. Yet another possibility deserves consideration. Perhaps Sacred Ridge represents an episode of internal conflict rather than an attack by a distant enemy. If rival factions within the same broader community turned against one another, the massacre could have been driven by political struggles, accusations, revenge, or attempts to eliminate a competing lineage. Archaeological evidence cannot easily distinguish between these possibilities. And then there is the question of what happened to the survivors. The destruction appears to have been followed by abandonment. If the attackers came from another settlement, why did they leave the site rather than occupy it permanently? If the conflict was internal, what happened to those who remained? Did survivors flee into neighboring communities, or did the violence permanently alter the local social landscape? Some interpretations have explored the possibility that the victims belonged to a marginalized or targeted population. Others have suggested that the site reflects a broader pattern of warfare and social instability affecting the region. None of these explanations can fully reconstruct the event. The physical evidence gives us fragments: fractured bones, burned material, abandoned structures, and objects left behind by people whose lives abruptly ended. Archaeologists can determine patterns of trauma with increasing precision, but intention remains much harder to recover. Sacred Ridge therefore occupies an uneasy place in the archaeological record. It demonstrates that organized violence existed in the ancient Southwest, but it also warns against reducing complex communities to a single narrative of warfare. Perhaps the most haunting question is not simply who killed the inhabitants, but what sequence of events made such violence possible. What grievances had accumulated before the first blow was struck? How long had tensions been building, and why did the surviving community disappear afterward? The ridge remains silent, but its buried evidence continues to suggest that the final chapter of Sacred Ridge was far more complicated than the broken bones alone can reveal. Somewhere between conflict, retaliation, social division, and ritual lies an explanation still incomplete, and the ground may not yet have yielded every piece of it. After the violence preserved at Sacred Ridge, the archaeological record offers another kind of mystery, one not defined by a single massacre, but by the gradual emptying of an extraordinary city. Near the Mississippi River, across from present-day St. Louis, broad fields conceal the remains of Cahokia, a settlement whose monumental earthworks once transformed the landscape. At its height, Cahokia was the largest known urban center in pre-Columbian North America north of Mexico. Between roughly AD 900 and 1350, its population expanded dramatically. Homes, plazas, ceremonial structures, and enormous earthen mounds formed a carefully organized city that connected communities across the Mississippi Valley. Then, over time, people began to leave. The disappearance was not sudden in the way a catastrophic destruction might be. There is no archaeological layer showing that Cahokia was simply wiped out overnight. Instead, evidence suggests a long process of population decline and abandonment, making the mystery considerably more difficult to solve. What caused a city of such scale to lose its population? One of the leading explanations involves environmental pressure. Cahokia depended heavily on agriculture, particularly maize cultivation. As the population grew, enormous quantities of food would have been required to support the community. Deforestation, soil exhaustion, changing rainfall patterns, and flooding may have placed increasing stress on the local environment. The Mississippi River itself could also be unpredictable. Flooding may have damaged agricultural land and settlements, while changes in river channels altered access to resources and transportation routes. At the same time, periods of drought could have reduced crop yields. A society dependent on a delicate balance between water and agriculture may have become increasingly vulnerable when that balance shifted. But environmental change may not tell the entire story. Archaeologists have also identified evidence suggesting that social and political tensions developed within Cahokia. Palisades were constructed around parts of the city, indicating concerns about conflict. Their presence raises the possibility that violence, competition, or political instability became serious enough to threaten the settlement. Could the walls have been a response to external enemies? Or were they built because Cahokia's own social structure was becoming increasingly unstable? Another possibility involves disease and population movement. Although direct evidence for epidemic disease is limited, large population centers can create conditions in which illness spreads more efficiently. At the same time, people may have relocated voluntarily as economic opportunities, political alliances, or environmental conditions changed. And there is an important detail that complicates the idea of a complete disappearance. Cahokia did not simply cease to matter. Native communities continued to inhabit the Mississippi Valley after the city's decline. Indigenous traditions, settlements, and cultural practices persisted across the region. The disappearance was therefore not the vanishing of a people, but the decline of one particular urban and political center. That distinction matters. Some popular theories have imagined warfare, famine, environmental catastrophe, or even some unknown event as the single explanation for Cahokia's abandonment. Yet, the archaeological evidence points toward a much more complicated process. Several pressures may have converged over generations, rather than producing one decisive collapse. Perhaps Cahokia became too large to sustain. Perhaps its political system could no longer maintain the authority required to organize such a vast population. Or perhaps families simply began moving elsewhere, gradually transforming a powerful city into a landscape of monuments without the population that had built and maintained them. There is also something deeply revealing about what was not left behind. Unlike some ancient cities elsewhere in the world, Cahokia provides no written account explaining its decline. There is no final inscription describing a disaster, no surviving ruler recording the last days of the city, and no definitive explanation passed down through a written archive. Instead, there are mounds, abandoned structures, layers of soil, broken pottery, charcoal, seeds, bones, and traces of changing settlement patterns. Together, they tell us that something fundamental changed. But what was the final turning point? Was Cahokia slowly weakened by environmental stress, fragmented by political conflict, transformed by migration, or reshaped by several forces acting at once? The great mounds remain on the landscape, silent reminders of a city that once drew thousands of people into its orbit. The people did not simply disappear, yet the urban world they created eventually faded. From the open sandstone landscape of northwestern New Mexico, the walls of Pueblo Bonito rise in sweeping arcs, their weathered surfaces catching the changing light of Chaco Canyon. Once part of a remarkable regional center, the great structure contained hundreds of rooms, ceremonial spaces, storage areas, and carefully engineered passageways. Yet, some of its most intriguing evidence was discovered not in the rooms above ground, but deep within the structure itself. Pueblo Bonito was constructed and expanded over several centuries, reaching its greatest prominence between roughly AD 850 and 1150. It became one of the largest and most complex architectural centers of the ancestral Pueblo world. Timber from distant mountain ranges, carefully shaped sandstone, and enormous quantities of labor were brought together to create a settlement whose scale still challenges our understanding of the society that built it. Then, archaeologists discovered the burials. In 1897, excavations led by George Pepper uncovered 2 richly furnished human burials in a chamber known as Room 33. The remains belonged to adults who had been placed beneath the floor, accompanied by extraordinary quantities of artifacts. More than 1,000 turquoise pieces were recovered, along with shell ornaments, stone objects, and other valuable materials. The discovery immediately suggested that these were not ordinary burials. One individual had been buried with an assemblage of objects that indicated exceptional status. The other was interred nearby, and the relationship between the two has remained an important subject of archaeological investigation. Who were these people? For many years, interpretations focused on hierarchy. Perhaps they were leaders, ritual specialists, or members of an elite lineage whose influence extended across Chaco Canyon. Their grave goods could have represented wealth, political authority, ceremonial importance, or connections with distant regions. But the deeper archaeologists looked, the more complicated the picture became. Recent research has examined biological relationships between individuals buried at Pueblo Bonito, including evidence suggesting that some people within the structure belong to the same maternal lineage. This has raised the possibility that authority at Chaco may have been connected to hereditary status transmitted through family lines. If so, Room 33 may preserve evidence of a powerful lineage rather than simply the grave of a single ruler. That interpretation has changed how some researchers view the entire building. Pueblo Bonito may not have functioned as an ordinary residential settlement. Its rooms, plazas, ceremonial spaces, storage facilities, and unusual architectural features suggest that it served multiple purposes. Large quantities of imported materials also indicate extensive networks connecting Chaco Canyon with distant communities. The turquoise alone is remarkable. Thousands of pieces were recovered from Pueblo Bonito, while shells and other exotic materials demonstrate long-distance connections. These objects reveal a society participating in exchange networks that extended far beyond the immediate canyon. Yet, the burials raise an even deeper question. Why were certain individuals placed beneath the floors of such an important building? Burial within a structure could have connected the dead to the place itself, creating a continuing relationship between ancestors, lineage, architecture, and community. The presence of prestigious objects may have reinforced that connection, transforming the burial chamber into a physical statement of identity and authority. But not every interpretation is so straightforward. Some researchers have questioned how much political power these individuals actually possessed. Others emphasize that modern concepts such as royal tomb or king can distort the archaeological evidence. The people of Chaco left no written records explaining their social system, and their monuments must be interpreted through incomplete traces. There are also unanswered questions about why Room 33 was eventually sealed and incorporated into later construction. Was the chamber deliberately preserved as an ancestral space? Did later generations recognize a special connection to the people buried there? Or had the meaning of the original burials changed over time? Perhaps the most compelling mystery lies in the relationship between the dead and the architecture surrounding them. The people buried beneath Pueblo Bonito were not simply placed in the earth and forgotten. Their remains became part of a structure that continued to evolve long after their deaths. Centuries later, the sandstone walls still stand above the burial chamber. What did those ancient builders believe they were preserving beneath their floors? And what significance did those buried ancestors hold for the generations that continued to live among them? Beyond the dry basin of western Nevada, where sagebrush stretches beneath an immense sky, a low limestone formation opens into a chamber that once offered shelter from the harsh Great Basin environment. Lovelock Cave is not imposing from the outside. Its entrance looks more like a weathered opening in the rock than the setting for one of the region's most intriguing archaeological discoveries. Yet, inside, researchers found evidence of people who had used the cave for thousands of years. The earliest occupations at Lovelock Cave reach back several millennia. The cave became especially important because its unusually dry conditions preserved organic materials that would normally disappear in the open landscape. Baskets, woven objects, plant remains, feathers, tools, and other artifacts survived in remarkable condition, creating an unusually detailed record of life in ancient Nevada. Human remains were also recovered. Some were naturally preserved by the cave's dry environment, while others represented deliberate burials. Their presence attracted considerable attention during excavations in the early 20th century, particularly after mining operations disturbed portions of the site before systematic archaeological work began. Over time, stories about Lovelock Cave became increasingly dramatic. Local legends and later popular accounts began describing unusually tall human beings supposedly discovered inside the cave. Some versions claimed that enormous skeletons had been recovered, while others connected the remains to a legendary race of red-haired giants. The story is compelling, but the archaeological evidence is much more restrained. There is no reliable scientific evidence establishing that Lovelock Cave contained a population of giant humans. Measurements from documented human remains do not support the extraordinary heights described in later popular stories. The red hair, often mentioned in accounts, can also be explained without invoking an unknown human species. Hair can undergo chemical changes during burial, while pigment and environmental conditions may alter its appearance over time. So, where did the legend come from? One possibility is that genuine archaeological discoveries became mixed with oral traditions, newspaper reports, incomplete excavation records, and later retellings. Once an unusual story enters popular culture, details can become amplified with each retelling. Yet, Lovelock Cave remains fascinating even without the giants. Among its most remarkable discoveries were large numbers of duck decoys, some constructed from reeds and other organic materials. These objects provide a rare glimpse into ancient hunting practices and suggest sophisticated knowledge of local wetlands and waterfowl. At a time when the surrounding landscape could appear barren, the ancient inhabitants of the region were exploiting a much richer ecological environment than the modern visitor might expect. The cave itself preserves clues to that changing world. Lovelock Cave was located near what was once a much larger wetland system associated with the Humboldt Sink. Water, marshes, fish, birds, and edible plants could have supported communities living in an otherwise demanding environment. The people who used the cave were therefore not isolated wanderers. They possessed specialized technologies, organized hunting strategies, woven materials, and knowledge accumulated across generations. But the human remains still invite deeper questions. Who were the individuals buried or left within the cave? Were they members of the same communities that created the baskets and hunting equipment? Did the cave serve as a burial place, a temporary shelter, a storage location, or several of these things at different times? And how did later generations understand the people who came before them? The mystery becomes more complicated because Lovelock Cave was not excavated under modern archaeological standards from the beginning. Early collecting and mining activity disturbed portions of the deposits, and some artifacts and human remains entered private collections. As a result, researchers today must reconstruct parts of the archaeological record from incomplete documentation. That absence of context has allowed speculation to flourish. Some fringe interpretations continue to suggest that the cave contained evidence of an unknown population or unusually large humans. Mainstream archaeology does not support those conclusions, but the persistence of the stories reveals something important. Whenever physical evidence is incomplete, imagination tends to occupy the empty spaces. Perhaps the real mystery is quieter. Lovelock Cave preserves traces of people who adapted to a landscape that has changed dramatically since they lived there. Their woven objects, hunting equipment, plant remains, and burials survived because of an unusual combination of climate and geology. But much was lost before modern researchers could document it. How many stories once connected these objects to the people who created them? What did the cave mean to those who returned there generation after generation? and how much of its archaeological record disappeared before anyone understood its importance. The cave still holds fragments of that forgotten world, while the most dramatic stories surrounding it remain difficult to separate from the evidence. Perhaps further research will clarify what happened there, or reveal that some of Lovelock's oldest mysteries were never preserved in the cave at all. The sandstone cliffs of southwestern Colorado rise above the surrounding landscape in layers of pale rock, juniper, and open sky. Along these cliffs lies Castle Rock Pueblo, an ancestral Pueblo settlement whose walls preserve traces of ordinary domestic life. Rooms built from stone and mud, grinding stones, pottery fragments, storage spaces, and the remains of structures once filled with families. Yet, beneath this record of daily life, archaeologists encountered evidence of something far more disturbing. Castle Rock was occupied during the late 13th century, a period when communities across the Four Corners region were experiencing significant changes. Populations shifted, settlements were abandoned, and relationships between neighboring groups appear to have become increasingly strained. Then came violence. Excavations at Castle Rock revealed human remains bearing evidence of severe trauma. Some individuals had suffered blows to the skull, while other remains showed injuries consistent with violent encounters. The evidence suggested that at least some people died during a period of conflict rather than through ordinary causes. But the pattern was not easy to reconstruct. Who attacked the settlement? Were the victims residents of Castle Rock, members of another community, or people caught in a wider conflict? Archaeologists generally interpret the violence within the broader context of instability affecting the region during the late 1200s. Environmental pressures, including prolonged drought, may have contributed to competition for scarce resources. Communities dependent on farming would have faced increasing difficulties if rainfall became unreliable and agricultural production declined. Yet, environmental stress alone does not explain a violent death. The presence of defensive architecture at some settlements suggests that conflict had become an important concern. Walls, enclosed compounds, and locations offering natural protection could all have served practical purposes during periods of insecurity. Castle Rock appears to have been part of this changing landscape. The most unsettling evidence comes from the human remains themselves. Trauma patterns can sometimes reveal the type of weapon involved, the direction of an impact, and whether an injury occurred close to the time of death. At Castle Rock, these clues point toward episodes of interpersonal violence. But violence can emerge from many causes. Perhaps neighboring communities fought over agricultural land or water. Perhaps long-standing disputes escalated into raids. Another possibility is retaliation, in which an earlier attack created a cycle of revenge that continued across generations. There is also a broader question about the fate of the settlement. Castle Rock was eventually abandoned, as were many other communities across the region. The timing is significant. By the end of the 13th century, large portions of the Four Corners region were undergoing major population movements toward areas farther south and east. Was violence one of the forces pushing people away? It may have been, but archaeologists are careful not to reduce the entire migration to warfare. Drought, ecological change, social transformation, political reorganization, and shifting trade networks likely interacted in complicated ways. The archaeological record also leaves room for uncertainty. A fractured skull tells us that a person suffered a severe injury. It does not tell us what the attacker believed, what dispute preceded the encounter, or whether the event was part of a larger campaign. And then there is the possibility that some of the violence occurred after death. Damage to skeletal remains can result from many processes, including deliberate manipulation, accidental disturbance, animals, and later construction. Distinguishing these causes requires detailed examination, and interpretations can change as new analytical techniques become available. This makes Castle Rock particularly compelling. The site does not present a single dramatic event with a complete explanation. Instead, it offers fragments of a society under pressure: fortified architecture, abandoned rooms, damaged human remains, and traces of people who once cultivated the surrounding land. Perhaps the final years of Castle Rock were marked by fear. Perhaps the violence was brief and isolated, followed by decisions to relocate. Or perhaps the settlement experienced a longer period of tension that gradually made remaining there impossible. The stones cannot tell us which possibility is correct. They can only preserve the physical traces left behind. Centuries later, the cliffs remain, while the people who knew what happened have disappeared from the record. What pressures transformed neighboring communities into enemies, and what final event convinced the survivors that their home could no longer be their future? Castle Rock offers evidence of violence, but not its complete story. And somewhere beyond the excavated walls, there may still be evidence capable of revealing how the final chapter truly unfolded. High above the canyons of southwestern Colorado, the sandstone alcoves of Mesa Verde still hold the remains of an extraordinary world. Cliff dwellings cling to sheltered rock faces, their masonry walls rising from the stone as though they were built into the canyon itself. Rooms, kivas, storage spaces, and traces of household activity reveal a society that adapted to a demanding landscape for generations. Then, near the end of the 13th century, something changed. The ancestral Pueblo people who had lived across Mesa Verde began leaving. The transformation was not an overnight disappearance. For centuries, communities had occupied mesa tops and canyon settlements, cultivating crops, gathering wild resources, constructing increasingly sophisticated architecture, and maintaining connections with neighboring regions. By the late 1200s, however, many settlements were being abandoned. The final generation left behind an archaeological puzzle. Why did people who had invested so much labor into their homes, fields, and ceremonial spaces decide to relocate? One of the strongest explanations involves climate. Tree ring records indicate that the late 13th century brought a period of severe and prolonged drought across much of the Southwest. Rainfall became less reliable, and agricultural production would have become increasingly difficult. For farming communities dependent on maize, even several years of poor harvests could create serious pressure. But Mesa Verde's environment was already demanding. Limited water, thin soils, and unpredictable rainfall meant that communities had always needed strategies for managing risk. They cultivated different locations, stored food, gathered wild plants, and maintained social connections that could provide support during difficult periods. So, why did the system eventually break down? The answer may involve more than climate alone. Archaeologists have also found evidence of increasing violence during the final centuries of occupation. Defensive structures appeared in some settlements, while skeletal remains from parts of the region show injuries consistent with interpersonal conflict. Could competition over food, water, and productive land have intensified as drought persisted? It is possible, but another interpretation suggests that social and political changes may have been equally important. When resources become scarce, communities do not automatically collapse. They may reorganize, relocate, form new alliances, or develop different systems of leadership. Perhaps the people of Mesa Verde were making calculated decisions rather than simply fleeing disaster. The archaeological record supports this possibility. By the late 1200s, ancestral Pueblo communities were moving toward regions that are now northern New Mexico and Arizona. Their descendants did not vanish. Instead, they became part of new communities farther south, carrying traditions, technologies, religious practices, and cultural memories with them. This is one of the most important details in the Mesa Verde mystery. The people left. Their culture did not. Yet, the circumstances surrounding their departure remain uncertain. Some settlements were abandoned relatively carefully, while others contain objects and structures that suggest abrupt changes in occupation. Certain rooms contain stored materials or household debris, while other areas appear to have been deliberately closed or altered. What happened during those final years? Was the movement primarily a response to drought? Did warfare make some locations unsafe? Did declining agricultural productivity undermine established communities? Or did changing political and religious relationships encourage people to seek entirely new places to live? There are also more speculative interpretations. Some have imagined catastrophic social collapse or prolonged conflict as the decisive factor. Others have emphasized migration as a deliberate cultural transformation, rather than a collapse at all. Neither perspective completely explains every archaeological detail. Perhaps the most revealing evidence comes from the landscape itself. The cliff dwellings were not simply homes. They were part of a broader network of settlements, farms, ceremonial spaces, and trails. Abandoning them meant leaving behind generations of accumulated labor and memory. Yet people chose, or were compelled, to do so. And when they departed, they carried much of their world with them. The silence of Mesa Verde can therefore be misleading. What appears to be a vanished civilization was actually a major migration within a living cultural tradition. The descendants of those communities continued to inhabit the Southwest, preserving knowledge that archaeologists can still trace today. But the final generation remains difficult to understand. Did drought push them beyond the limits of survival? Did violence accelerate a decision already underway? Or did a combination of environmental, political, and social pressures gradually make Mesa Verde less sustainable? The cliffs preserved the places they left behind, but not the conversations that shaped their final decisions. Perhaps somewhere in an unexcavated settlement, an overlooked structure, or a forgotten agricultural field lies another piece of evidence. Until then, the final chapter of Mesa Verde remains incomplete, a story of departure whose true cause may have been more complicated than any single explanation can capture. From the sun-baked valleys of the American Southwest, where sandstone cliffs rise above dry washes and scattered juniper, archaeologists have recovered human remains that reveal a disturbing side of prehistoric life. Among the most unsettling discoveries are isolated human skulls and evidence of decapitation found at several ancestral Pueblo sites, raising difficult questions about warfare, ritual, and the treatment of enemies. The evidence does not come from one mysterious chamber or a single archaeological site. Instead, it appears across portions of the Southwest during different periods, with examples of human remains showing signs that some individuals may have been killed and decapitated. But a skull separated from a body does not explain why. Archaeologists examining such remains look closely at cut marks, fractures, weathering, and the position of the bones. Marks made with stone tools can sometimes indicate where soft tissue was removed, while patterns of damage around the neck may help determine whether separation occurred close to the time of death. In some cases, the evidence suggests deliberate decapitation. The question then becomes one of motive. One possibility is warfare. During periods of environmental stress and social instability, conflict between communities could become increasingly severe. A defeated enemy might have been killed and decapitated as an act of violence, retaliation, or intimidation. In societies where reputation and collective identity were deeply important, displaying the remains of an enemy could potentially communicate power to survivors. But archaeology offers another possibility: ritual. Across human societies, the treatment of the dead has often carried meanings extending far beyond ordinary burial. The body could represent ancestry, spiritual power, political authority, or danger. Removing the head might therefore have served a symbolic purpose, rather than simply reflecting battlefield violence. Some archaeological contexts in the Southwest have encouraged researchers to consider whether certain human remains were deliberately manipulated after death as part of ceremonial practices. Yet, caution is essential. It is tempting to connect every unusual burial to ritual sacrifice or warfare, but human remains can be disturbed for many reasons. Construction, later burials, animals, erosion, and other processes can separate bones and alter their original positions. Archaeologists therefore depend on the broader context before assigning meaning to an isolated skull. Still, several discoveries remain difficult to explain. Some remains show evidence consistent with violent injury around the time of death. Others appear to have been handled after death. In certain cases, skulls were placed in locations that seem different from ordinary burial contexts. Could these have been trophies? The idea has appeared in interpretations of some prehistoric southwestern remains, particularly where decapitation and unusual placement occur together. Yet, there is no single explanation that applies to every example. Another possibility involves social conflict within communities. Not every act of violence requires an outside enemy. Political struggles, disputes between families, accusations, or cycles of revenge could also produce extreme treatment of the dead. If the head represented identity or social power, separating it from the body may have carried a meaning that has been lost. There are also more speculative theories. Some popular accounts have suggested that unusual skulls represent evidence of mysterious outsiders, secret cults, or unknown practices brought into the Southwest from distant regions. Such ideas remain unsupported when compared with the broader archaeological record, but they persist because the evidence itself is fragmentary, and the motives behind ancient violence are difficult to reconstruct. The reality may be both more ordinary and more complicated. The people who lived in the ancient Southwest were farmers, hunters, builders, traders, parents, and community members. They created intricate architecture and developed sophisticated relationships with their environment. Violence existed within this world, but it does not define the societies that practiced it. Perhaps that is what makes the severed heads so unsettling. They provide a glimpse into moments when familiar social boundaries may have broken down. Someone once stood before another human being and made a decision that separated a life from its final resting place. Who was the victim? Who carried out the act? Was the head feared, honored, displayed, or simply discarded? The archaeological record can sometimes reveal the physical sequence of events, but the meaning remains far more elusive. Across the Southwest, fragments of these stories remain scattered through caves, settlements, burial grounds, and abandoned structures. Each skull is a silent piece of evidence from a world whose beliefs have largely disappeared. And until the surrounding context becomes clearer, the reason some people were separated from their bodies remains an unresolved chapter, one that may still conceal motives no excavation has fully recovered. On a broad mesa in northeastern Arizona, the remains of Awatovi Pueblo lie beneath the open sky, surrounded by the dry grasslands of the Hopi region. From a distance, the site appears quiet and almost featureless. Yet, the buried foundations preserve the remains of a settlement that survived for centuries before meeting a violent end in the late 17th century. Awatovi was not simply an abandoned prehistoric village. It was a living Hopi community when Spanish missionaries established a mission there in the early 1600s. Over the following decades, the settlement became one of the most significant centers of Spanish influence among the Hopi villages. The mission introduced Catholic religious practices, new political pressures, and profound changes to the community. But those changes did not affect everyone in the same way. By the late 1600s, tensions had developed between Awatovi and other Hopi communities. Missionary activity, conversion efforts, political disagreements, and relationships with Spanish authorities created divisions that reached far beyond questions of religion. Then, in 1700, Awatovi was destroyed. The archaeological evidence indicates that attackers from other Hopi villages entered the settlement and killed a large number of its inhabitants. Buildings were burned, the mission was destroyed, and the surviving residents were removed from the site. What could have driven neighboring communities to destroy one of their own? The answer appears to lie partly in the complicated political and religious environment of the time. Spanish missionaries had attempted to establish Catholic institutions among the Hopi. At Awatovi, some residents had accepted Christianity, while others opposed the changes. Missionaries sometimes sought to suppress traditional ceremonies and religious practices, creating tensions within communities whose spiritual traditions were deeply embedded in everyday life. From the perspective of those who opposed the mission, Awatovi may have represented more than a neighboring settlement. It could have become a symbol of Spanish influence. Some historical accounts describe strong hostility toward Awatovi's Christian converts and the missionaries associated with them. When the attack came, the violence appears to have been directed against the settlement itself, rather than simply against an external Spanish military force. Yet, the story is more complicated than a simple conflict between traditional religion and Christianity. Hopi communities were politically independent, and relationships between villages could be shaped by rivalry, resource concerns, family divisions, and questions of authority. The presence of Spanish missionaries added another layer to existing tensions. Perhaps Awatovi became caught between competing visions of the future. Archaeological evidence from the destruction layer provides a physical record of the attack. Burned architectural remains, broken objects, and human remains indicate that the settlement did not simply decline gradually. It was violently dismantled. But what happened inside the village during those final hours? The surviving evidence cannot provide a complete account. Some residents were killed, while others were taken away and incorporated into neighboring communities. The mission itself was destroyed, effectively ending Spanish religious activity at Awatovi. For centuries afterward, the ruins remained a reminder of a community that had been deliberately erased. Modern archaeology has revealed how complex the settlement had become before its destruction. Excavations have uncovered architecture, pottery, tools, food remains, and other evidence showing that Awatovi was deeply connected to both Hopi traditions and the wider colonial world. This makes its destruction particularly significant. It was not simply the collapse of a village. It represented a decision by neighboring communities to eliminate a settlement that had come to embody a dangerous political and religious relationship. Still, some questions remain. Was the attack primarily an act of religious resistance? Was it driven by political concerns about Spanish authority? Did long-standing tensions between Hopi villages contribute just as much as missionary activity? Perhaps all of these forces converged. There is also a deeper question about the people who lived at Awatovi. Historical records tend to emphasize missionaries, religious conflict, and political decisions. Archaeology, however, reveals another story: the ordinary lives of families who cooked, farmed, traded, built homes, raised children, and practiced traditions within a changing world. Their lives ended or were transformed when the settlement was destroyed. Today, the ruins of Awatovi remain largely silent. The walls that once carried the sounds of daily life have returned to the landscape, while the circumstances of that final confrontation survive only through archaeological evidence and later accounts. What did the inhabitants believe would happen before the attack began? How much warning did they receive? And how did the survivors remember the destruction after they were forced to leave? The fire eventually disappeared, but the questions remain. beneath the quiet earth of Awatovi, fragments of that final chapter still wait to be interpreted, and they may reveal that the destruction of the Pueblo was not the end of a story, but the beginning of another. In the dry basin of western Nevada, where rocky hills meet broad stretches of sagebrush and the air carries almost no moisture, a small opening in the landscape once concealed one of North America's most remarkable ancient burials. Known as Spirit Cave, the site offered protection from the harsh desert climate, and, for thousands of years, preserved the remains of a man whose identity would become the subject of an extraordinary scientific investigation. The burial was discovered in 1940 by archaeologists Sydney and Georgia Wheeler. Inside the cave, they encountered human remains wrapped in a woven tule mat and placed in a flexed position. At first, the burial appeared important primarily because of its unusual preservation. The man had been naturally mummified by the cave's exceptionally dry conditions. For decades, the remains were generally regarded as those of an ancient Native American individual, but the exact age of the burial remained uncertain. Later, scientific testing changed the picture dramatically. Radiocarbon dating placed Spirit Caveman at approximately 10,600 years old. That made the burial one of the oldest known naturally mummified human remains in North America. The discovery immediately raised broader questions about the people who lived across the continent during the earliest periods of human settlement. Who were they? How had their communities developed? And how closely were they related to indigenous populations living in North America today? For years, researchers had only limited evidence with which to approach those questions. The Spirit Cave remains became particularly important because DNA technology eventually allowed scientists to examine the man's genetic ancestry. In 2018, researchers reported that genetic evidence connected him to indigenous peoples of the Americas, demonstrating continuity that earlier interpretations had sometimes failed to recognize. The result was significant not simply because of the age of the burial, but because it helped challenge older assumptions about the origins and movements of ancient populations. Yet, the scientific story contains another layer of uncertainty. The remains had been removed from their original context decades earlier, and eventually came under the care of the Nevada State Museum. As archaeological and indigenous perspectives on human remains changed, questions about ownership, cultural affiliation, and respectful treatment became increasingly important. For the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe, the Spirit Cave remains were not merely archaeological specimens. They represented an ancestor. In 2016, after years of research and discussion, the remains were returned to the tribe. Genetic research had helped establish an unexpected connection between an individual who lived more than 10,000 years ago and indigenous people living in the region today. That connection transformed the meaning of the discovery. Spirit Cave was no longer simply a scientific window into deep prehistory. It became part of a continuing human story involving ancestry, identity, memory, and the responsibilities of archaeology. But the ancient man still leaves many questions unanswered. What was his life like? He lived during a period when the Great Basin was environmentally different from the landscape we see today. Ancient lakes and wetlands occupied portions of the region, supporting fish, birds, plants, and other resources. Communities would have needed detailed knowledge of seasonal changes and water sources to survive. Was Spirit Cave used regularly by his community, or was it selected specifically for burial? Why was his body wrapped in plant material and placed in the position archaeologists found? Was the burial accompanied by ceremonies that left no surviving trace? The cave provides only fragments of the answer. Scientific analysis can reveal age, ancestry, diet, disease, and aspects of physical life. Archaeology can reconstruct portions of the environment surrounding him, but personal identity, the memories he carried, the people who knew him, and the beliefs surrounding his death remains beyond direct recovery. That uncertainty is part of what makes Spirit Cave so compelling. The mummy once seemed to belong to a distant and almost inaccessible world. Modern genetic research revealed something more complicated. The deep past is not necessarily disconnected from the present. A man buried thousands of years ago can still have descendants, cultural relatives, and a place within living indigenous history. And perhaps the greatest mystery is not simply how old Spirit Caveman was, but how many generations remembered him before the cave fell silent. What did those who placed him there hope would happen to his memory? The desert preserved his body for more than 10,000 years. The questions surrounding his life, his death, and his place in the story of North America may take much longer to answer. After the remarkable survival story preserved at Spirit Cave, the archaeological record returns us to a very different kind of evidence, one shaped not by preservation, but by destruction. In southwestern Colorado, amid rolling mesas, sandstone ridges, and wide valleys, the remains of Sand Canyon Pueblo lie quietly beneath the open sky. What appears today as a scattering of stone walls once formed part of a substantial community whose final chapter ended in violence. Sand Canyon Pueblo was occupied during the late 13th century, a period of profound change across the Mesa Verde region. The settlement contained hundreds of rooms and numerous kivas, suggesting a sizable and socially complex community. Its position near productive farmland and natural resources would have made it an important place for people living through an increasingly difficult period. Then the evidence begins to change. Excavations revealed human remains displaying signs of violent death. Some individuals had suffered severe trauma, including injuries to the skull. Other remains were found in contexts that did not resemble ordinary burials. The pattern suggested that violence had reached the settlement on a significant scale. But what happened at Sand Canyon? One of the leading explanations places the massacre within the broader environmental and social pressures affecting the region around AD 1280. Tree ring evidence indicates that the late 13th century experienced prolonged drought. For farming communities dependent on maize, repeated crop failures could have placed enormous pressure on food supplies. As resources became harder to obtain, competition may have intensified. Yet drought alone does not explain the remains. Archaeologists have identified evidence suggesting that some settlements became increasingly defensive during this period. Walls, restricted entrances, and other architectural features may indicate concerns about security. Sand Canyon itself appears to have contained elements that could have offered protection during periods of conflict. Were these defenses built because attacks had already begun, or were they simply precautions in an increasingly uncertain landscape? The human remains provide more disturbing clues. Trauma to the skull can indicate violent encounters, but interpreting the sequence of events remains difficult. An injury may reveal that a person was attacked, yet it cannot explain who the attacker was or what motivated the confrontation. Some evidence from Sand Canyon has also contributed to discussions about post-mortem treatment. Certain remains appear to have been disturbed or processed in ways that differ from ordinary burial practices. This has led some researchers to consider whether the violence involved more than killing alone. Could enemies have been deliberately desecrated after death? Could the treatment have served as intimidation or retaliation? Or were some of the unusual remains produced by later disturbance? The answers are uncertain. It is tempting to imagine a single invading force arriving at the Pueblo, but the archaeological record may represent something more complicated. Violence could have involved neighboring communities, shifting alliances, revenge, or conflicts within a broader network of settlements. There may even have been several episodes of violence rather than one catastrophic event. Sand Canyon also raises questions about the people who survived. By the end of the 13th century, many ancestral Pueblo communities in the Mesa Verde region were relocating southward. Their descendants did not disappear. They became part of communities farther south and east, carrying cultural traditions with them. So, was Sand Canyon simply another settlement caught in a widespread migration? Or did violence accelerate its abandonment? Perhaps the answer lies in the relationship between climate and social instability. Drought may have reduced agricultural production, while population pressure and competition made neighboring communities less willing to share limited resources. Once trust broke down, conflict could have created a cycle that was difficult to reverse. Still, this remains an interpretation rather than a complete explanation. The people who lived at Sand Canyon left behind architecture, pottery, stone tools, food remains, and human bones. They did not leave a written account describing the final days of their community. That silence makes the site especially haunting. Imagine a settlement filled with ordinary sounds, people grinding maize, children moving between rooms, conversations around fires, ceremonies within kivas. Then, somewhere near the end of its history, those sounds were replaced by violence. What triggered the final confrontation? Was it hunger, territorial conflict, retaliation, political rivalry, or a combination of pressures that had been building for years? The ruins cannot tell us everything. They preserve the aftermath, but not the intentions of those involved. And as the stones continue to weather beneath the Colorado sky, the final story of Sand Canyon Pueblo remains incomplete, a record of a community whose last generation may have witnessed a transformation far more complex than the scattered remains alone can reveal. The landscape around Crow Creek rises quietly from the Missouri River, its grassy slopes giving little indication of what lies beneath the soil. In the open prairie of what is now South Dakota, the remains of an ancient fortified settlement once stood above the river valley. For centuries, the site preserved traces of ordinary life: houses, tools, pottery, food remains, and fragments of human existence. But when archaeologists began examining the burial deposits at Crow Creek, they encountered evidence of violence on a scale that would make the site one of the most disturbing archaeological discoveries in North America. The Crow Creek site dates to roughly the 14th century AD, a period when several agricultural communities occupied the northern Great Plains. Archaeological work revealed a fortified village associated with the initial Middle Missouri tradition, a society whose people cultivated crops, hunted, traded, and lived in substantial earth lodge communities. Then came the graves. More than 400 individuals were represented in a mass burial discovered outside the settlement's defensive earthworks. Many of the skeletons showed signs of violent injury. Cut marks appeared on bones, skulls displayed trauma, and some remains carried evidence consistent with scalping. The pattern suggested that these were not deaths caused by disease, accident, or a single isolated confrontation. Something far more deliberate had taken place. The evidence has generally been interpreted as the aftermath of a violent attack on the community. The victims included men, women, and children, indicating that the violence extended beyond combatants. Some individuals appear to have suffered multiple injuries, while others showed damage consistent with blows from weapons. The remains were subsequently placed together in a mass burial, rather than being given the more orderly treatment normally associated with routine funerary practices. The presence of scalping evidence adds another layer to the story. Scalping was practiced by some indigenous peoples of North America, but its meaning and circumstances varied greatly between communities and periods. It could be connected to warfare, ritual, social status, or the taking of trophies. The discovery at Crow Creek, therefore, does not simply reveal that scalping occurred. It raises a deeper question. What kind of conflict produced such concentrated violence at this particular settlement? The most widely accepted explanation is warfare between neighboring communities competing for territory, resources, security, or access to productive land. Environmental pressures may also have intensified existing tensions. Drought, population movement, declining resources, and competition among increasingly fortified settlements have all been considered as possible factors in the broader pattern of conflict visible across the region. Yet, Crow Creek resists being reduced to a single explanation. The sheer concentration of injured and mutilated bodies has led some researchers to consider whether the attack represented more than an ordinary military encounter. Could it have been a retaliatory raid, a massacre carried out after a prolonged dispute, or perhaps an episode connected to wider instability affecting several communities across the Great Plains? There are even more speculative interpretations, though the archaeological evidence cannot establish them with certainty. Some have suggested that the violence might have been connected to cycles of revenge, social upheaval, or desperate competition during a period of environmental stress. Others have wondered whether the settlement was deliberately targeted because of its strategic position near the Missouri River. But the bones themselves cannot tell us who the attackers were. No surviving written account records the event. There is no ancient chronicle naming the victims or describing the conflict. Archaeologists must reconstruct the sequence from fractures, cut marks, burial patterns, artifacts, settlement defenses, and the broader environmental record. And that leaves Crow Creek suspended between evidence and uncertainty. The graves tell us that something catastrophic happened. They reveal violence, death, and deliberate treatment of the dead. But they do not preserve the voices of those who witnessed the attack, nor the reasons that brought one community against another. Standing above the quiet Missouri landscape today, it is difficult to reconcile the peaceful surroundings with the evidence beneath them. The prairie gives no visible sign of the moment when the settlement was overwhelmed. Perhaps that is what makes Crow Creek so unsettling. The archaeological record preserves the final consequences with remarkable clarity, while the motives remain largely concealed. How much of the story has already been recovered, and how much still lies hidden beneath the soil, waiting to change our understanding of what happened here? From the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, Chaco Canyon unfolds beneath an immense sky, its sandstone walls glowing softly in the changing light. Scattered across the canyon floor are the remains of monumental settlements built by ancestral Pueblo communities more than 1,000 years ago. Among them stand the great houses, enormous complexes of masonry, timber, and ceremonial architecture that once connected communities across a vast region. And within this landscape, archaeologists have found something unexpectedly deliberate. Evidence that some of Chaco's most important ceremonial spaces were not simply abandoned, but carefully closed, dismantled, and in certain cases deliberately destroyed. The great Kivas are among the most striking features of Chaco Canyon. These enormous circular structures were partially excavated into the ground and roofed with massive timbers. Their scale distinguishes them from ordinary domestic rooms. Archaeological evidence suggests they were places of communal gathering and ceremony, although the exact rituals performed inside them remain difficult to reconstruct. One of the most famous examples is Casa Rinconada, a monumental great Kiva positioned near Pueblo Bonito. Its enormous circular chamber contains benches, masonry walls, recessed features, and carefully arranged architectural elements. The builders invested extraordinary effort in creating these spaces, yet centuries later, that effort appears to have been reversed. Across Chaco, archaeologists have documented evidence of burning, dismantling, filling, and intentional closure associated with certain ceremonial structures. In some locations, roofs were removed and structures were filled with debris. In others, burning appears to have played a role in the final treatment of the building. Why would a community deliberately destroy a place that had required so much labor to construct? The simplest explanation may be that these acts represented a form of ritual closure. In many societies, abandoning an important ceremonial structure does not necessarily mean leaving it untouched. A building can be retired through deliberate acts that symbolically end its use. Fire, dismantling, burial, or the removal of significant architectural elements may have transformed a living ceremonial space into something considered complete. This interpretation is especially compelling at Chaco because the destruction does not always resemble uncontrolled violence. There is little reason to assume that every burned or dismantled structure represents warfare. Some evidence suggests that certain buildings were carefully closed rather than simply attacked. Objects may have been deposited, architectural features altered, and spaces intentionally sealed. But the pattern becomes more difficult when viewed alongside the broader changes taking place in Chaco society. By the late 11th and early 12th centuries, the canyon had experienced enormous growth. Great houses expanded, ceremonial architecture multiplied, and networks connected Chaco with distant communities. Yet, eventually, the system began to change. Construction declined, populations shifted, and people increasingly moved away from the canyon. Environmental pressures may have contributed. Periods of drought, changing rainfall patterns, and stresses on agricultural production could have made life in the region increasingly difficult. Political or social changes may have mattered as well. If Chaco's influence depended partly on networks of cooperation, pilgrimage, exchange, or authority, disruptions to those networks could have weakened the entire system. Some more speculative interpretations go further. Could the destruction of ceremonial spaces have represented a deliberate rejection of an older religious or political order? Might communities have been closing sacred places because their meanings had changed? Or could the destruction have marked a conscious decision to separate themselves from the institutions that once centered on Chaco? There is no single archaeological answer. Even the word destruction can be misleading. To modern eyes, dismantling a roof or burning a ceremonial structure looks like destruction. To the people who performed those actions, however, the process may have represented transformation rather than simple destruction. Perhaps the building was not being erased. Perhaps it was being released. That possibility makes the ruins of Chaco even more enigmatic. The stones preserve the architecture, but not the intentions behind the final ceremonies. We can identify where fires burned, where walls collapsed, where spaces were filled, and where structures were abandoned. What remains inaccessible is the meaning those actions carried for the people who performed them. As the sun moves across the canyon, the great Kivas once again appear silent and empty. Yet their final moments may have been anything but meaningless. Were these places destroyed because an entire social order was collapsing? Or were they carefully transformed according to beliefs we can no longer fully understand? And if the builders intended their final acts to communicate something, how much of that message is still buried within the walls of Chaco Canyon? Not far from the ancient landscapes of the American Southwest, the earth can appear almost deceptively ordinary. Low vegetation, weathered soil, and scattered traces of stone and adobe softened by centuries of exposure. At a place known as Burnt Corn Pueblo, however, archaeologists encountered evidence that transformed an otherwise quiet archaeological site into something far more unsettling. The name itself seems almost ominous, but the real mystery lies beneath the surface. Burnt Corn Pueblo was a prehistoric settlement associated with ancestral Puebloan communities, and, like many settlements across the Southwest, it preserves evidence of domestic life: architecture, pottery, tools, food remains, and traces of people who once lived within its walls. Yet, archaeological investigations revealed human remains concentrated in a burial context that raised difficult questions about how and why these individuals died. A mass burial is different from an ordinary cemetery. In a conventional burial ground, Bodies are usually placed according to established customs, sometimes accompanied by objects or carefully arranged within individual graves. A mass grave can indicate something entirely different: a sudden crisis, an unusual mortality event, or circumstances that disrupted normal funerary practices. At Burnt Corn Pueblo, the concentration of human remains has been associated with a violent episode, leading researchers to consider the possibility of conflict between neighboring communities. Across the prehistoric Southwest, violence was not unknown. Settlements sometimes became fortified, defensive architecture appeared in certain regions, and archaeological evidence from several sites records injuries consistent with interpersonal or organized conflict. But interpreting a mass grave is rarely straightforward. A collection of bodies does not automatically reveal who killed whom or why. Bones can preserve physical trauma, but they cannot preserve names, alliances, accusations, or memories. Even when injuries are visible, determining whether they occurred during a single event, over several episodes, or at different stages of an individual's life can require careful analysis. So, what might have happened at Burnt Corn? One possibility is a sudden attack on the settlement. In such a scenario, inhabitants may have been killed during a period of conflict and buried together afterward because the community had been disrupted. If the attackers remained nearby, survivors may have had little time to perform elaborate funerary ceremonies. Another possibility is that the burial reflects a broader period of instability rather than one isolated massacre. Drought, competition over agricultural land, declining resources, and population movement could have placed neighboring communities under increasing pressure. When resources become scarce, existing tensions can become more dangerous. The Southwest of this period was not a static world. Communities expanded, reorganized, migrated, and sometimes disappeared from locations they had occupied for generations. Environmental change could have played a role, but so could social transformation. And this is where Burnt Corn becomes particularly intriguing. If the individuals in the grave died during conflict, were they victims of a single raid? Was the violence connected to a larger regional struggle? Or did something more complicated occur? Perhaps a sequence of confrontations whose final consequences were eventually gathered into one burial. More speculative interpretations have sometimes imagined large-scale warfare or organized attacks between culturally distinct populations. Such possibilities can be difficult to prove archaeologically, however. Similar pottery styles, architectural traditions, and material remains do not always correspond neatly to political identities. The people involved may have shared language, ancestry, trade networks, or religious traditions even while competing violently with one another. There is another possibility that makes these graves difficult to interpret. The final burial itself may have carried a meaning that is no longer visible to us. A mass grave could have been practical. It could also have been symbolic. The decision to place numerous individuals together may have reflected emergency circumstances, community mourning, ritual requirements, or an attempt to restore order after catastrophe. The archaeological record rarely tells us which explanation is correct. This uncertainty is what gives Burnt Corn Pueblo its quiet sense of unease. There is no surviving account describing the event. No witness left a written explanation. The people who knew exactly what happened are separated from us by centuries, and the evidence they left behind consists largely of fragments. A broken wall, a buried vessel, a damaged bone, a concentration of human remains. Each provides a small piece of the story, but none provides the whole. And perhaps the most haunting aspect is not simply that people died, but that someone eventually had to decide what to do with their remains. Their burial represents a final human response to an event that the archaeological record can only partially reconstruct. Standing at such a site today, the landscape offers little indication of the violence that may once have occurred there. Wind moves across the soil, vegetation grows over ancient surfaces, and the traces of habitation slowly disappear. Yet, beneath that quiet ground may remain evidence capable of changing the story once again. Was the mass grave the aftermath of a single devastating attack, the result of prolonged regional conflict, or a burial shaped by circumstances we no longer recognize? And if the people of Burnt Corn left behind a final message through the way they buried their dead, what might still be waiting beneath the earth to reveal what happened? From the banks of the San Juan River in northwestern New Mexico, the remains of Salmon Pueblo rise from the desert like the weathered skeleton of a vanished world. Long walls of sandstone, fragments of rooms, and the outlines of ancient ceremonial spaces still trace the enormous settlement that once stood here. Built around AD 1090, Salmon was one of the great Chacoan outlying communities, a massive, three-story complex containing hundreds of rooms, a great Kiva, and a distinctive tower Kiva. For generations, people lived within these walls. But sometime in the late 13th century, something changed. By about AD 1280, Salmon Pueblo was abandoned, and much of the settlement had been burned. The fire was not simply the result of accidental destruction. Archaeological evidence indicates that large portions of the pueblo were intentionally burned, leaving behind layers of charcoal, scorched architecture, and objects caught in the final moments of occupation. And among those remains was evidence far more difficult to interpret. In the western rooms, archaeologists found stores of corn that had been consumed by the fire. In the central portion of the pueblo, the roof of the tower Kiva had burned intensely enough to partially cremate the remains of nearly 20 children and several adults. For years, these discoveries encouraged an alarming interpretation. Perhaps Salmon had been attacked, its inhabitants killed, and the settlement deliberately destroyed by enemies. It was an explanation that seemed to fit the ruins. Fire, abandonment, human remains, a community disappearing at the end of a turbulent period. But archaeology rarely remained satisfied with its first interpretation. Later analysis produced a more complicated picture. The human remains did not provide clear evidence of widespread warfare, and researchers began considering whether the cremation occurred as part of the deliberate closing of the settlement rather than as the direct consequence of an attack. The distinction is profound. If the dead were victims of warfare, Salmon tells a story of conquest and massacre. If the remains were deliberately cremated during abandonment, the event may instead represent a ritual act associated with the community's final departure. So, why burn a place that had been inhabited for nearly 2 centuries? The history of Salmon makes the question even more complicated. The original Chacoan inhabitants were not necessarily the final population. After the Chacoan period ended around the early 12th century, local Middle San Juan communities continued to occupy the settlement. They altered its architecture, divided earlier rooms, added more than 20 small kivas, and transformed spaces according to their own needs and traditions. Salmon was therefore not a frozen Chacoan monument. It was a living place that changed as different generations inhabited it. By the 13th century, however, the wider region was undergoing profound transformation. Communities across the northern Southwest were relocating. Environmental pressures, including periods of drought, likely affected agricultural production, while changing political and social relationships may have altered the importance of settlements such as Salmon. By around AD 1300, much of the San Juan Basin had been abandoned in favor of other regions, including the Zuni and Acoma areas, the Hopi Mesas, and the Rio Grande Valley. Could Salmon's destruction have been part of this larger transformation? That is one possibility. The burning may have marked the formal end of a community rather than its violent defeat. The people leaving may have intentionally destroyed portions of the settlement, perhaps as part of ceremonies surrounding abandonment. In this interpretation, fire was not merely an instrument of destruction. It was a means of transforming a place whose social or spiritual life had reached its end. Yet, another possibility remains more difficult to dismiss. Could conflict have played some role? The Southwest was not a uniformly peaceful landscape, and some settlements show evidence of violence during periods of instability. But at Salmon, the archaeological evidence does not provide a simple picture of a victorious army storming a settlement. The absence of strong evidence for widespread warfare makes the traditional massacre scenario increasingly difficult to sustain. Perhaps the most intriguing evidence comes from the burned structures themselves. Some fires were extraordinarily intense, consuming stored food and transforming objects through heat. At least one structure contained a remarkable concentration of botanical remains preserved by the fire, including corn, beans, squash, piñon nuts, and other foods. Archaeologists have determined that this particular fire occurred in the fall, shortly after harvest. That detail gives the destruction an unsettling precision. If people were leaving, why choose the period immediately after harvest? Were they preparing for a planned migration? Was the stored food deliberately burned so that it would not remain behind? Or did the fire accompany a ceremonial act whose meaning has been lost? There are more speculative possibilities, of course. Some interpretations have imagined warfare, retaliation, or social conflict as contributing factors. Others might see the destruction as part of a deliberate ritual death of the settlement itself. Neither explanation fully resolves every detail, and perhaps that is why Salmon Pueblo remains so compelling. The ruins preserve the evidence of a final act, but not the thoughts of the people who performed it. We know that the settlement endured for generations, that its architecture was repeatedly transformed, and that much of it ultimately disappeared beneath deliberate fire. We know that human remains were caught within that final episode, yet later research has made the story of their deaths more complicated rather than simpler. Today, the sandstone walls stand quietly beside the San Juan River. What once may have been a thriving center of community life ended in smoke and abandonment. Whether that final fire represented violence, ritual closure, migration, or some combination of forces remains uncertain. And if the people of Salmon deliberately chose fire to mark the end of their world, what did they believe they were leaving behind? And what might still be hidden beneath the burned rooms that could finally explain why they chose to leave? From a distance, White Sands appears almost otherworldly. Vast fields of brilliant gypsum stretch across southern New Mexico, forming smooth dunes that shift beneath the wind and sunlight. Yet, beneath this pale landscape lies a record of human movement that reaches far deeper into the past than archaeologists once believed possible. It is a place where the evidence is not carved into stone or buried inside a tomb. It is pressed into the ground. At White Sands National Park, researchers have identified thousands of fossilized human footprints preserved within layers of ancient sediment. Some tracks belong to animals that lived during the last ice age, including mammoths and giant ground sloths. Others were made by people walking across the landscape when these enormous creatures still inhabited the region. The discovery transformed a seemingly familiar landscape into something much more ancient. For decades, the accepted archaeological timeline placed the arrival of humans in the Americas relatively late in the last ice age. The earliest widely accepted sites generally dated to roughly 13,000 years ago, or somewhat earlier. But the footprints at White Sands appeared to tell another story. Initial dating suggested that some of the tracks could be approximately 23,000 years old. If correct, that would place humans in North America during the last glacial maximum, when massive ice sheets covered large portions of the northern continent. The implications were enormous. How could people have reached the region while so much of the continent remained locked in ice? And what were they doing in this landscape? The footprints themselves offer tantalizing clues. Some tracks appear alongside the impressions of Ice Age animals. In certain locations, human footprints overlap animal tracks, allowing researchers to reconstruct moments of movement across the ancient terrain. One remarkable possibility is that people walked through landscapes inhabited by mammoths and giant ground sloths, perhaps following the same shorelines and paths used by animals. But the footprints do not tell us exactly who these people were. They reveal movement rather than identity. A footprint preserves the shape of a foot, the direction of travel, and sometimes the behavior of the person who made it. A sequence can suggest whether someone was walking, running, carrying something, or moving alongside another person. In some cases, the tracks seem to preserve fleeting encounters. A person may have stepped into a muddy shoreline, leaving a clear impression before the sediment hardened and was later buried. Then, time covered everything. For thousands of years, the ancient lake bed remained hidden beneath layers of sediment. Only much later did changing environmental conditions expose sections of the buried surface, allowing modern researchers to recognize the faint impressions. The mystery deepened when the dating itself became controversial. The original age estimates were based largely on radiocarbon measurements of seeds associated with the footprint-bearing layers. Some researchers questioned whether aquatic plants could have absorbed older carbon from the lake environment, potentially making the dates appear older than they really were. That criticism did not end the investigation. Subsequent studies using different dating approaches produced evidence supporting an age of around 21,000 to 23,000 years for the footprints. The debate remains scientifically important because the question is not simply about one archaeological site. It concerns when and how humans first spread across the Americas. If the White Sands evidence is correct, humans were present in what is now New Mexico thousands of years earlier than the traditional timeline once allowed. That possibility forces archaeologists to reconsider an enormous portion of the continent's early history. Perhaps humans arrived much earlier than once believed, following routes along the Pacific coast or through landscapes that have since disappeared. Perhaps small populations moved southward long before large, visible archaeological settlements appeared. Their camps may have been destroyed, buried, submerged, or simply never discovered. More speculative interpretations go further, proposing that people may have entered the Americas during multiple early migrations rather than through a single movement. But extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that is precisely why White Sands remains so important. The evidence is not a mysterious artifact whose origin can be endlessly reinterpreted. These are physical footprints embedded within ancient sediments. Their significance depends on accurately establishing the age of the layers in which they were preserved. The footprints also remind us how incomplete the archaeological record can be. A human settlement may disappear. Wooden tools decay. Camps can be scattered by wind and water. Coastal sites may now lie beneath the sea. But under the right circumstances, something as fragile as a footprint can survive for tens of thousands of years. Perhaps the people who crossed this ancient shoreline never imagined that their passage would endure. They may have been following animals, traveling between seasonal camps, gathering resources, or simply moving across the landscape. To them, the prints were temporary marks in mud. To us, they have become evidence of an ancient presence that may force an entire chapter of human history to be rewritten. And as the wind continues to reshape the dunes at White Sands, one question remains quietly suspended over the brilliant landscape. If human footprints survived here by chance for more than 20,000 years, how many other traces of those earliest Americans are still waiting beneath landscapes that have not yet revealed what they contain? From the quiet wetlands of central Florida, the landscape around the Windover archaeological site gives little indication of what lies beneath the waterlogged earth. Cypress trees, shallow ponds, and dense vegetation create an environment that seems ordinary for the region. Yet, beneath one of these ancient wetlands, archaeologists uncovered something extraordinary: a cemetery containing the remains of hundreds of people who lived more than 7,000 years ago. The discovery began in 1982, when construction activity near a small pond in Brevard County exposed human bones. At first, there was little reason to suspect that the site would become one of the most important archaeological discoveries ever made in North America. Then, archaeologists began excavating. What emerged from the wet soil was a burial ground unlike almost anything previously encountered in the region. More than 160 individuals were eventually identified, many of them remarkably well preserved by the unusual chemistry of the bog. Some burials retained fragments of brain tissue, soft tissue, hair, and other organic material that would normally disappear within centuries. The waterlogged environment had created an unexpected archive. For thousands of years, the bodies had remained sealed beneath layers of peat and sediment. The absence of oxygen slowed decomposition, allowing delicate remains to survive long after the people who buried them had disappeared from the landscape. And the deeper researchers looked, the more complicated the story became. The people of Windover lived during the Archaic period, around 6,000 to 5,000 BC. They were not members of a large agricultural civilization with monumental buildings or written records. Instead, they belonged to mobile hunter-gatherer communities that moved through the wetlands, forests, and waterways of prehistoric Florida. Yet, their burials reveal a surprising degree of care. Many individuals had been placed in shallow graves beneath the pond. Their bodies were arranged deliberately, often with the knees drawn toward the chest. Wooden stakes or poles appear to have been used in some burials, perhaps to hold the bodies beneath the waterlogged sediments. What did these burial practices mean? There is no written explanation. The arrangement could reflect a shared funerary tradition, practical methods for keeping bodies in place, or beliefs about death and the transition between worlds. Perhaps all three were connected. The remains themselves provide another extraordinary source of information. Because the preservation was so unusual, scientists were able to study aspects of these ancient people's lives that are normally invisible in archaeological populations. Microscopic examination of bones and preserved tissue revealed evidence of disease, injury, diet, and physical stress. Some individuals suffered from infections and degenerative conditions. Others showed evidence of serious injuries that had healed, suggesting that they survived dangerous accidents or violence. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery involved the preserved brains. In ordinary archaeological burials, the brain is among the first tissues to disappear. At Windover, however, several skulls contained dark, shrunken material where brain tissue had once been. Laboratory analysis indicated that the material retained characteristics consistent with preserved human brain tissue. For archaeologists, this opened an extraordinary window into the distant past. Researchers could investigate biological material from people who lived thousands of years before written history in the Americas. But Windover's most revealing discoveries may have been found in the small objects buried alongside the dead. Textiles, woven materials, wooden artifacts, and other organic objects survived in the same waterlogged conditions. These remains demonstrate that the people of Windover possessed technological knowledge far more sophisticated than the stereotype of a simple prehistoric hunter-gatherer might suggest. They worked plant fibers. They made cordage. They produced woven materials. They created tools and carefully prepared graves. The site therefore challenges a simplistic image of archaic societies as people merely wandering from place to place without complex social traditions. Windover appears to have been part of a community with strong connections to its dead. Some individuals were buried with objects that may have been personal possessions or offerings. The effort required to prepare graves and place bodies beneath the wetland suggests that burial was not an incidental act. It was a deliberate social practice, and that raises a deeper question. Why did this particular place become a cemetery? Was the pond already considered special before people began burying their dead there? Did generations repeatedly return because the location carried ancestral meaning? Or was the wetland chosen because its waterlogged soil offered practical advantages for preserving or containing the bodies? The archaeological evidence cannot provide a definitive answer. The mystery becomes even more compelling when the ages of the individuals are considered. Men, women, and children were buried at Windover, suggesting that the cemetery represented an entire community rather than a narrowly defined group. The presence of children is especially significant. Their graves demonstrate that the community invested in funerary practices even when the dead were very young. Some individuals may have died from disease or infection, while others may have suffered nutritional stress or injuries. The cemetery therefore preserves something more profound than isolated skeletons. It preserves a population. Through the bones, researchers can begin reconstructing patterns of health, mobility, diet, and social life. The people of Windover were not anonymous prehistoric figures. Their remains reveal individuals who experienced childhood, illness, injury, aging, and death. And yet, despite this extraordinary preservation, the central questions remain. What did these people believe about death? Did they imagine that the dead continued to exist somewhere beyond the physical world? Were the bodies intentionally placed in the pond because water had spiritual significance? Did the burial rituals represent a journey, a return to ancestors, or simply a practical tradition passed from one generation to another? Archaeologists can study the physical evidence, but belief is harder to recover. Some more speculative interpretations have imagined that the cemetery reflects an unusually sophisticated spiritual tradition, perhaps involving ritual specialists or elaborate concepts of the afterlife. Such possibilities cannot be ruled out completely, but neither can they be demonstrated from the surviving evidence alone. What is certain is that the people of Windover cared for their dead. The graves required preparation. Bodies were positioned deliberately. Some were associated with objects and woven materials. The community repeatedly returned to the same place over generations. That continuity is perhaps the most haunting feature of the site. Imagine the landscape thousands of years ago. People moving through the wetlands in small groups. Fires glowing near temporary camps. Children growing up beside the water. Hunters returning from the surrounding forests. And nearby, beneath the surface of a quiet pond, the remains of earlier generations resting in carefully prepared graves. Then, eventually, the cemetery was abandoned. The reasons are unknown. Perhaps the community moved elsewhere as the environment changed. Perhaps the pond became unsuitable. Perhaps social traditions shifted, or the people simply followed resources into another part of the landscape. Whatever happened, the cemetery remained sealed. For more than 7,000 years, the wetland slowly accumulated layers of sediment above the graves. Generations disappeared. Languages changed. Entire cultures transformed. The landscape itself was altered. And then, in the 20th century, construction activity accidentally reopened the ancient cemetery. What had been invisible became visible again. Windover is therefore more than an archaeological site. It is a rare intersection between human memory and geological chance. Without the unusual chemistry of the bog, the organic remains would almost certainly have vanished. Without the accidental discovery, the cemetery might have remained hidden for centuries longer. The people buried there left no written names. They left no monuments. They left no surviving account of their beliefs. Instead, they left bones, woven fibers, fragments of tools, preserved tissue, and the physical arrangement of their graves. Those fragile traces are enough to tell us that a community once stood here and cared deeply about what happened to its dead. But perhaps the most mysterious part of Windover is what remains beyond scientific measurement. We can determine how old the burials are. We can examine disease, trauma, diet, and genetics. We can reconstruct aspects of their physical lives with remarkable precision. What we cannot reconstruct with the same certainty is what they thought as they lowered their dead into the dark, waterlogged earth. Did they believe the burial was an ending, a passage, a return? High above the rugged landscape of southeastern Utah, two sandstone formations rise from the horizon like the ears of an enormous creature watching over the desert. This is Bear's Ears, a landscape of deep canyons, narrow mesas, springs, cliffs, and hidden alcoves, an environment where traces of human activity can remain remarkably well preserved for centuries. Scattered throughout this immense region are the remains of ancestral Puebloan settlements, including structures that archaeologists sometimes describe as great houses. Their walls are often reduced to foundations and broken masonry, yet even these fragments reveal something remarkable. People built substantial communities here. They constructed rooms from carefully shaped stone, organized settlements around plazas, created storage spaces, and established places for gathering and ceremony. Some structures were positioned in locations that offered commanding views of the surrounding landscape. But the mystery of Bear's Ears is not simply that these settlements existed. It is why they were built where they were, and why so many were eventually abandoned. The Bear's Ears region contains hundreds of archaeological sites representing thousands of years of human activity. Earlier, hunter-gatherers occupied the landscape long before ancestral Puebloan communities developed large agricultural settlements. Over time, people adapted to the difficult environment, cultivating crops such as maize while relying on wild plants and animals. The architecture became increasingly substantial. Some settlements contain multiple rooms arranged around open spaces. Others include towers, storage facilities, and structures whose purposes remain uncertain. In certain areas, settlements appear to have been connected to broader networks extending across the Colorado Plateau. This raises an important distinction. A great house was not necessarily a single residence. In the broader ancestral Puebloan world, monumental structures could serve social, ceremonial, political, economic, or multiple overlapping functions. They may have brought together people from surrounding communities for gatherings, exchange, rituals, or communal work. Bear's Ears therefore appears to have been more than a collection of isolated villages. The landscape itself may have helped organize the communities that lived there. Mesa tops provided defensible locations. Springs offered critical water. Canyons created natural corridors through the desert. Agricultural plots could be established where soils and moisture permitted. And yet, the region was never an easy place to live. Rainfall was unpredictable. Water was limited. Crops could fail. Temperatures could fluctuate dramatically. A community that depended heavily on maize agriculture had to understand the landscape intimately. So, why invest so much labor in large stone structures? One explanation is that monumental architecture strengthened social cooperation. Constructing large buildings required labor, planning, and coordination. A great house could therefore become a physical expression of community identity. It could also have served as a place where authority was concentrated. But archaeologists continue to debate exactly how centralized ancestral Puebloan society became. There is no evidence of a single empire controlling the entire region in the way a modern state might. Instead, Bear's Ears may have been part of a complex network of communities connected through kinship, trade, ritual, migration, and shared traditions. The architecture hints at connections. The meaning remains harder to recover. Some great houses appear to have been carefully planned. Others seem to have developed gradually, with rooms added and modified over generations. This suggests that these settlements were not necessarily built according to one master plan. They evolved, and perhaps that is one reason the ruins are so difficult to interpret. A structure may have served one purpose when it was built, and another centuries later. A room that began as a storage facility might eventually have become a ceremonial space. A plaza could have hosted gatherings, feasts, dances, or rituals that left almost no physical trace. Stone survives. Meaning does not. There is also the question of abandonment. Across the Four Corners region, many ancestral Puebloan settlements were abandoned during the late 13th century. Environmental changes, prolonged drought, declining agricultural productivity, social conflict, migration, and changing regional networks have all been proposed as contributing factors. But abandonment was not necessarily disappearance. The people who left Bear's Ears did not simply vanish. Their descendants continued living elsewhere across the Southwest, carrying traditions, memories, languages, and cultural identities into new communities. From this perspective, the empty structures may represent migration rather than extinction. Still, the physical abandonment can appear abrupt. A settlement that had been maintained for generations could suddenly cease to receive new construction. Storage rooms were no longer replenished. Fires went cold. Footpaths disappeared beneath sediment. Why? The conventional explanation is environmental and social transformation. Climate conditions changed. Drought placed pressure on agriculture. Communities may have moved toward areas with more reliable water or stronger social connections. But there may have been more than one reason. A prolonged environmental crisis can reshape political relationships. Scarcity can create competition. Competition can encourage migration. Migration can weaken existing institutions. Perhaps the abandonment of Bear's Ears was not a single event at all, but the final stage of a long transformation. More speculative interpretations have focused on the possibility that some structures held astronomical or ceremonial significance. The broader ancestral Puebloan world contains architecture with deliberate orientations toward solar events, landscape features, and celestial cycles. Could some Bear's Ears structures have been designed with similar intentions? Possibly, but interpreting every alignment as astronomical would be risky. People naturally build according to terrain, sunlight, water access, visibility, and practical needs. Some apparent patterns may be intentional, while others may be the product of geography. The difficulty is separating deliberate symbolism from coincidence. There are also stories and traditions preserved by modern native communities that give these landscapes meanings extending beyond archaeological measurements. For descendants of ancestral Puebloan peoples, places such as Bear's Ears are not simply abandoned ruins. They exist within living cultural landscapes. That perspective changes the mystery. The question is no longer simply what these buildings were used for. It becomes how their meaning survived after the structures themselves ceased to function. Perhaps a great house was important not because of its walls, but because of the relationships created around it. Perhaps the ceremonies mattered more than the architecture. Perhaps the landscape itself was the sacred element, with buildings serving only as temporary expressions of a much older relationship between people, water, animals, ancestors, and the sky. Archaeology can uncover foundations, hearths, tools, pollen, seeds, and fragments of pottery. It can reconstruct diets and migration patterns. It can identify construction phases and estimate when communities were occupied, but it cannot easily recover the emotional world of the people who walked through these rooms. At Bear's Ears, that absence is especially powerful. The desert preserves traces with extraordinary clarity. A stone wall can remain visible for hundreds of years. A grinding stone can lie exactly where someone abandoned it. A fragment of pottery can preserve evidence of food preparation or artistic tradition. Yet the voices are gone. Imagine approaching one of these settlements centuries ago. Smoke rising above the roofs, people moving through narrow doorways, corn stored in cool rooms, children playing near a plaza, elders gathering beneath the open sky. Perhaps ceremonies taking place inside spaces whose meanings are now impossible to reconstruct. Then, gradually, the activity stops. The buildings remain. The people move on. Wind fills the rooms with dust. Rain cuts through the masonry. And centuries later, archaeologists arrive to find only fragments. Bear's Ears therefore presents a mystery not of disappearance, but of transformation. The great houses were real. The communities were real. Their architectural achievements are visible. What remains uncertain is the exact social and spiritual world that produced them. Were these monumental structures centers of regional authority, ceremonial gathering places, communal residences, or something that combined all three? Were their locations chosen primarily for practical reasons, sacred associations, or a relationship between the two that modern categories cannot easily separate? And when the people finally left, did they believe they were abandoning these places, or carrying their meaning with them? The sandstone formations still stand above the desert, watching over canyons where ancient paths have nearly disappeared. Beneath the soil, additional rooms, burials, tools, and organic traces may still remain untouched. Perhaps future discoveries will clarify how these great houses functioned. Or perhaps the most important mystery will remain beyond excavation. What did these places mean to the people who built them, and how much of that meaning still survives in the landscape of Bear's Ears? Along the remote western edge of Washington state, where the Pacific Ocean meets dense coastal forest, the landscape seems almost untouched by time. Waves strike the rocky shore, rain moves through towering trees, and thick vegetation covers the ground with astonishing speed. Near Lake Ozette, however, the earth once preserved something that would eventually allow archaeologists to look directly into the daily life of a Maca community from more than 5 centuries ago. The discovery began not with a carefully planned excavation, but with a quiet geological event. In the early 1970s, researchers working near the Ozette archaeological site recognized that something unusual had happened beneath the surface. A prehistoric village had been buried by a massive mudslide, sealing houses and their contents beneath layers of wet sediment. What might have been a catastrophe for the people living there became, centuries later, an extraordinary archaeological time capsule. The Ozette village was occupied by Maca people, whose descendants remain connected to the region today. The settlement stood along the Pacific coast near the western tip of the Olympic Peninsula, an environment rich in marine resources. People could fish offshore, harvest shellfish, hunt sea mammals, gather plants, and use the forests for timber and other materials. The village was not primitive in the simplistic sense sometimes applied to ancient societies. Its inhabitants had developed an elaborate coastal technology and social system adapted to a demanding environment. Then the mud came. The landslide appears to have buried portions of the settlement suddenly, preserving structures beneath thick layers of sediment. Unlike many archaeological sites where organic materials decay and disappear, Ozette's wet conditions helped protect wooden objects, woven materials, fishing equipment, household tools, and other fragile items. When archaeologists began excavating the buried structures, they encountered an extraordinary variety of objects: wooden bowls, bent wood containers, fishing equipment, ropes and cordage, mats, tools, weapons, fragments of clothing. Thousands upon thousands of artifacts emerged from the mud. The discovery offered something archaeologists rarely receive. Not merely isolated objects, but the contents of homes preserved almost exactly where they had been left. This distinction matters. At many archaeological sites, people occupied a place for generations, and later inhabitants disturbed earlier deposits. Objects were discarded, reused, broken, moved, or buried. Over time, the original arrangement disappears. At Ozette, the mudslide froze a moment. Rooms remained recognizable. Household possessions remained clustered together. Objects were sometimes found beneath collapsed roofs or near the places where people had used them. It was almost as if the village had been sealed overnight. And in a sense, that is precisely what makes Ozette so haunting. The disaster that destroyed the settlement also protected it. The geological event appears to have been associated with movement of saturated earth along the coastal landscape. Archaeological evidence suggests that the mudslide buried houses while preserving much of their contents. The precise circumstances surrounding the event, however, are still difficult to reconstruct in every detail. Was the village completely abandoned immediately afterward? Did people survive and return? Were some structures occupied again before another stage of abandonment? The evidence suggests a more complicated story than a single catastrophic moment. What is clear is that the site represents centuries of Maka occupation, followed by a remarkable preservation event. And what archaeologists found inside the houses reveals just how sophisticated daily life could be. The wooden architecture itself is impressive. Coastal peoples of the Pacific Northwest developed techniques for constructing large plank houses from massive trees. At Ozette, the preserved remains show how structural beams, wall planks, partitions, and household spaces were organized. These were not temporary shelters. They were substantial homes designed for long-term occupation. Within them, archaeologists found evidence of food preparation, storage, fishing, woodworking, weaving, and other activities. The objects also reveal a world deeply connected to the ocean. Fishing gear demonstrates the importance of marine resources. Tools associated with woodworking show how people transformed massive trees into buildings, containers, and specialized equipment. Hunting and gathering equipment reflects an economy that depended on a wide range of coastal and forest environments. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Ozette is the preservation of ordinary things. Archaeology often focuses on exceptional objects, ceremonial artifacts, monumental structures, weapons, or elaborate burials. Ozette offers something different. It preserves the mundane. A household tool, a broken wooden object, a woven mat, a piece of cordage, a container, a fishing implement. These are the objects that allow us to reconstruct how people actually lived. And the more archaeologists recovered, the clearer it became that the village was not simply a collection of isolated households. The organization of the houses suggests complex social relationships. Different spaces contain different categories of objects, allowing researchers to infer specialized activities and, perhaps, differences in household roles. This raises questions about the social structure of the community. Were certain families associated with particular occupations? Did some households have greater access to resources? Were specialized skills passed through generations? How were communal responsibilities organized? The objects cannot answer these questions directly, but they provide clues. The village also demonstrates something important about technological knowledge. The Maka were not simply adapting passively to their environment. They were actively engineering their relationship with it. They understood wood. They understood tides. They understood currents, fish behavior, coastal weather, and seasonal cycles. Their tools and structures reveal accumulated knowledge developed through generations of observation. And this knowledge becomes especially significant when considering the village's eventual burial. The Pacific Northwest coast is beautiful, but it is also geologically active. Heavy rainfall saturates slopes. Earthquakes can destabilize terrain. Coastal cliffs can collapse. Landslides can occur with little warning. For people living within this environment, understanding the landscape was essential. Yet, even communities possessing generations of environmental knowledge could not control every geological event. The mudslide may therefore have been a sudden disruption to an established community. But here the archaeological evidence leaves room for another possibility. Perhaps the village was not destroyed during a single moment of complete catastrophe. Perhaps sections of it were buried while people continued living elsewhere nearby. The preserved houses may represent only part of a much larger settlement system. That uncertainty is important because archaeological sites can create an illusion of completeness. When a village is preserved exceptionally well, it is tempting to imagine that we are seeing the entire community. But Ozette was almost certainly larger and more dynamic than the buried structures suggest. People moved. Families changed. Buildings were repaired and rebuilt. Objects were discarded and replaced. The settlement evolved over generations. The mudslide simply captured one fragment of that long history. There is another remarkable dimension to the site. The archaeological work was conducted with the involvement of the Maca community. This was not merely a scientific excavation of an abandoned ancient place. It involved a living indigenous community whose ancestors had occupied the region and whose cultural traditions remained connected to the landscape. That relationship changed how the discoveries could be understood. Objects recovered from the village were not simply museum specimens. They represented the material heritage of a people whose descendants were still present. The excavations therefore became an important example of archaeology intersecting with indigenous knowledge, identity, and cultural continuity. And this makes the mystery of Ozette different from many archaeological mysteries. The people did not truly vanish. Their descendants remain. The village was buried, but the culture that created it survived. For decades, archaeologists studied the artifacts to reconstruct ancient lifeways. Yet, many of the meanings associated with those objects cannot be fully recovered from physical evidence alone. Indigenous oral traditions, cultural knowledge, and relationships to the land can provide forms of understanding that excavation cannot reproduce. This raises a larger question about what archaeology actually means when studying indigenous places. Can an ancient object ever be separated completely from the living culture that produced it? At Ozette, perhaps the answer is no. The mudslide preserved a remarkable physical record, but it did not preserve every dimension of the community. It preserved wood, it preserved fiber, it preserved tools, it preserved architecture, it preserved fragments of daily life. But it could not preserve every conversation, every belief, every personal memory, or every meaning attached to the objects. Those things disappeared into time. Still, the site offers an extraordinary glimpse into the world of the Maca before European contact transformed the Pacific Northwest. It reveals a society capable of sophisticated architecture, specialized technologies, extensive use of marine resources, and complex household organization. High in the rugged canyon country of southeastern Utah, where sandstone cliffs rise above narrow valleys and juniper trees cling to the dry slopes, the ruins of Turkey Pen sit quietly within a landscape shaped by isolation. The remains are modest compared with the monumental structures of places such as Chaco Canyon, yet they preserve something far more intimate: traces of a community that lived, worked, suffered, and eventually disappeared from the site. Turkey Pen Ruin is associated with ancestral Puebloan occupation in the Cedar Mesa region, an area filled with cliff dwellings, storage structures, masonry rooms, and hidden alcoves. From the surface, There is little to suggest the disturbing story that archaeologists have tried to reconstruct from the human remains discovered here. The mystery begins with the dead. Archaeological investigations at Turkey Pen and other sites across the region have revealed evidence that some ancestral Puebloan communities experienced episodes of severe hardship and violence during the 13th century. Human remains can preserve signs of injury, nutritional stress, disease, and other forms of trauma. At Turkey Pen, the context of the burials has contributed to a long-standing debate about whether some individuals died during periods of conflict or social disruption. But identifying the cause of death thousands of years later is rarely simple. A damaged bone does not always indicate murder. A fracture might have occurred during an accident, during combat, or after death. A burial may reflect ordinary funerary practice, emergency circumstances, or a response to violence. Archaeologists must therefore examine the entire context rather than relying on a single disturbing discovery. And Turkey Pen becomes more interesting when viewed within the wider history of the region. During the late 13th century, many ancestral Puebloan settlements across the Four Corners experienced profound changes. Communities moved. Agricultural systems were disrupted. Some settlements were abandoned. Others became smaller or were reorganized. One factor repeatedly considered is drought. Tree ring records from the southwest reveal periods when rainfall became less reliable, including severe drought episodes during the late 13th century. For communities dependent heavily on maize agriculture, prolonged dry conditions could have created enormous pressure. But drought alone does not explain everything. A shortage of rain does not automatically produce violence. It creates conditions in which competition, migration, political instability, and social tensions can become more difficult to manage. Imagine a community already living close to the limits of agricultural productivity. A harvest fails. Then another is smaller than expected. Water becomes harder to obtain. Wild resources are increasingly important. Neighboring communities face the same pressures. At some point, the landscape itself can become a source of conflict. This is one of the mainstream explanations for episodes of violence documented across parts of the prehistoric Southwest. Competition for food, water, agricultural land, and secure settlement locations may have intensified during periods of environmental stress. Yet, there is a danger in turning this explanation into a simple story of drought causing warfare. Ancient communities were not passive victims of climate. They could change diets, move to new locations, expand trade networks, alter agricultural strategies, and reorganize social relationships. The people who lived around Turkey Pen understood their environment intimately. They knew where water could be found. They understood seasonal resources. They built storage facilities. They cultivated crops in difficult terrain. They adapted to the rhythms of the plateau. So, when the archaeological record shows death and abandonment, the question becomes more complicated. What finally overwhelmed their ability to adapt? The human remains provide only fragments of the answer. In some cases, skeletal evidence can reveal injuries consistent with interpersonal violence. Cranial trauma, fractures, and other patterns can indicate violent encounters, but even when trauma is present, determining the circumstances surrounding it can be difficult. Was the violence between neighboring communities? Was it internal? Was it connected to raids? Or did some injuries occur during isolated conflicts rather than organized warfare? There is no ancient written record to settle the question. No surviving chronicle identifies an enemy. No inscription describes a battle. No eyewitness account explains the final days. Instead, archaeologists must work backward from physical traces. This is where Turkey Pen becomes part of a much larger mystery surrounding the end of the ancestral Puebloan period in the northern Southwest. By the late 1200s, many settlements were abandoned. For a long time, archaeologists described this process in terms that could sound like disappearance. But the people did not simply vanish. Their descendants continued elsewhere. Communities relocated toward regions that include the Hopi Mesas, the Rio Grande Valley, the Zuni area, and other parts of the Southwest. Cultural traditions continued, changed, and adapted. The abandoned settlements therefore represent movement rather than the disappearance of an entire people. Still, some deaths remain difficult to explain. Could Turkey Pen preserve evidence of a violent episode that occurred shortly before abandonment? That possibility has attracted attention because violence is documented at other sites in the region during roughly the same broad period. But there is another interpretation. Perhaps the deaths reflect the cumulative effects of hardship rather than a single massacre. Malnutrition weakens the body. Disease spreads more easily among stressed populations. Injuries become harder to recover from. Food shortages can increase competition. A community experiencing several of these pressures simultaneously could suffer a mortality event without having been destroyed by an invading army. This distinction matters. A massacre and a population collapse can leave very different stories in the archaeological record, and the evidence does not always allow us to separate them cleanly. There are also more speculative interpretations. Some researchers and writers have suggested that episodes of violence in the late ancestral Puebloan period may have involved cycles of retaliation that extended across generations. A single killing could lead to revenge, which could provoke another attack, creating a pattern that eventually destabilized entire communities. Others have proposed that social or religious tensions may have played a role. When communities undergo rapid change, established institutions can lose authority. Ritual systems can be challenged. Groups can divide or migrate. Could something like this have happened around Turkey Pen? It is possible, but difficult to demonstrate. Archaeology can show that communities changed. It can sometimes show that people died violently. It cannot easily reconstruct the emotions, grievances, or beliefs that connected one event to another. That uncertainty makes the human remains especially important. Bones are often described as silent witnesses, but they are not entirely silent. They record stress. They record disease. They record injury. They record the physical consequences of lives spent working, traveling, hunting, farming, and surviving in a demanding environment. A skeleton can sometimes tell us whether a person experienced violence shortly before death, but it cannot tell us why, and that missing word, why, is at the heart of the mystery. Why did some people die while others survived? Why did communities remain in certain places while others moved away? Why were some settlements abandoned gradually, while others appear to have experienced abrupt disruption? And why did a civilization capable of building complex settlements and adapting to difficult landscapes eventually reorganize so dramatically? Perhaps the answer lies not in one event, but in the interaction of many. Climate, population, resources, conflict, migration, social change. Each factor may have contributed. The danger is assuming that one explanation must account for everything. Turkey Pen existed within a world of changing relationships. Communities were not isolated from one another. People exchanged materials, moved between settlements, married across communities, shared traditions, and sometimes competed. A drought in one region could influence another. A migration could alter pressure on neighboring lands. A political change could affect trade. A violent encounter could trigger another. The landscape itself could become part of the chain. And then, eventually, the settlement could be abandoned. The silence that followed would last for centuries. Today, Turkey Pen Ruin stands amid the same rugged terrain that shaped the lives of its inhabitants. The cliffs still cast long shadows across the canyon. Wind moves through the vegetation. Stone structures remain where people once gathered. It is tempting to see abandonment as an ending. But perhaps it was a transition. The people who left carried their knowledge with them. Their agricultural traditions, stories, technologies, social relationships, and spiritual practices did not necessarily end when the buildings became empty. The ruins are what remained behind. The people continued elsewhere, and yet, the deaths preserved in the archaeological record remain unresolved in a deeper sense.